All right. Hello, everyone. Okay, sounds like the mic is all right. So welcome to my talk on how to cultivate psychological safety in the context of site reliability management. Now, before I continue, I'll begin by saying that while this talk is centered around reliability management, it's applicable to many other contexts. So we'll talk about incident management, which put another way is crisis management, sustainable organizations, and leadership in general. So just a little bit of background on me. I'm normally a staff engineer on the reliability engineering org at the New York Times. Right now I'm on leave, so that's why I said normally. Outside of that, I love giving talks on observability, reliability management, and platform engineering. Now, over the course of my career, I've been on many engineering teams, and each team was unique in its own special way. Each had its own way of doing things, its own unique set of problems. But in spite of the complexity that each of these teams had, two things generally always remained true. The first is that teams always perform better when they feel psychologically safe. I'm sure this isn't surprising. Psychological safety is actually something that we talk about pretty frequently in tech, especially during hard times like we have been experiencing lately. Now, what I really want to emphasize, though, is that psychological safety is even more important for site reliability engineering teams or site reliability focused teams because of the nature of the work. Every engineer has at least one story of when they took down production or deleted some database. And the reason that we remember those stories so vividly is because they were stressful at the time, right? Especially when they happened to us when we were less senior. Incident management is stressful. It's a vulnerable time for our systems, but it's also a vulnerable time for ourselves. We're more prone to mistakes during times of stress. And we fear the consequences of mistakes that aren't necessarily our fault or individual fault, whether it's the personal consequences of a culture that lacks blamelessness, or of knowing the impact that comes with every issue that makes your systems down. And this is why reliability-focused teams need to be particularly thoughtful about building a psychologically safe environment. So I'll spend the rest of our time reviewing the principles and practices that I've found to be effective for reliability-focused teams. Now, before I do that, I'm going to take a step back and talk about how I came to develop my style of leadership. So I mentioned briefly that I'm a staff engineer. Previous to that, I was in ed tech and Google for Education and startups. And before that, I even did computational research focused on the education sector, worked as an analyst at an education nonprofit, and I spent hundreds of hours of my spare time teaching, tutoring, and mentoring students. And so in other words, right, I've been thinking about education my entire career. And one of the reasons for that is because I've always been obsessed with this idea that education should be the place where students are empowered to learn and become their best selves. And so many years ago, I encountered this idea of trauma-informed education or teaching, which is basically a methodology that considers how trauma impacts learning and behavior in the classroom. And this approach resonated deeply, especially as a woman of color in the United States, where we face the daily trauma of racist patriarchy, and as someone who's purposeful about working on teams that don't look like the cast of Silicon Valley. And so when I think about building psychologically safe teams, I come from an approach influenced by the principles of trauma-informed education. So now trauma-informed education actually has 7 core principles, but I'm just going to focus on 3 that influence my approach the most. So first, we have that psychological safety is created by building trust through respect, acceptance, and transparency. So what this means practically is that we can build trust by making the expectations of our team and culture clear. Right? There's an uneasiness that comes with ambiguity, especially during times of crisis. And this uneasiness is distracting, right? It makes us vulnerable to mistakes that have socio-technical consequences. And so we can strive for standard practices while making it clear that mistakes and failure are inevitable consequences of engineering and of being people. And simultaneously, we must show respect for each other by preparing for the fact that standard practices aren't always sufficient for everyone's needs, and that we need to strike a healthy balance of standardization and flexibility to accommodate the diversity of our teams and our systems. And by driving this clarity, we can show both the respect and acceptance required for building understanding and therefore trust. Secondly, the importance of empowerment, voice, and choice. We don't build trust within a team and then assume we just have it forever, right? Trust needs to be maintained continuously and renewed every single day. And a winning strategy for that is to continuously empower folks to raise challenges and issues because they trust that they'll be addressed or even feel empowered to address them themselves. Engineering is all about feedback loops, so building feedback loops that incorporate the voices of the members of your team is crucial to maintaining trust and empowering your engineers. And lastly, we have inclusion. The psychological safety of everyone on the team needs to be a top priority, and harm and bias should never be tolerated, right? We build our culture with the most vulnerable people in mind first, because when we build for the most vulnerable people in mind, we're way more likely to end up building for everyone in mind. And so tech has historically been pretty ineffective at prioritizing the experiences of marginalized people and our most vulnerable selves. So we must adapt our way of building culture and teams so that those of us who have been historically excluded are safe, supported, and embraced. So far we've focused on the importance of psychological safety and some of the principles behind that. But I mentioned that there are two things that always remain true for every team I worked on. And the second is that chronic problems are the most common threat to psychological safety. And what I mean by that is that chronic problems threaten psychological safety by eating away at your team's ability to be resilient to both change and failure. And the longer that chronic problems go unaddressed, the more you risk burning out even some of the strongest teams. And so what do I actually mean by chronic issues, right? That's kind of ambiguous, so let's just categorize it a little bit further. And so I define two main characteristics that distinguish them. The first is that these issues are repetitive or long-lasting, right? Think of your team or any community that you're a part of now. If you've been on it long enough, then you probably can pretty quickly identify some issues that you see come up over and over again, right? And the severity of these chronic issues does vary widely, but each of them poses some risk to your culture. At worst, they're those services or tools that break painfully often, making your on-call shifts unbearable. At best, right, they're those flaky end-to-end tests that you keep ignoring because they pass on retry, but in the back of your mind, you know you should probably take care of them before it comes back to bite you in the ass, or butt, sorry. And lastly, we have inclusion. The psychological safety of everyone on the team needs to be a top priority, and harm and bias should never be tolerated. We build our culture with the most vulnerable people in mind first, because when we build for the most vulnerable people in mind, we're more likely to build with everyone in mind, and I definitely went backwards, I'm so sorry. The second, okay. The second is that these problems tend to be very difficult to solve. Sorry about that. This is usually part of why they become chronic in the first place, but this is also part of why they're so important because chronic issues are some of the biggest indicators of complexity and organizational dysfunction. Reliability teams deal with chronic issues all the time, whether that's in the form of recurring monitors that frequently need to be actioned or toil, like Tanya mentioned earlier. Reliability teams So now let's get back to our principles from earlier, and how do these chronic issues impact our ability to hold true to these principles. So starting with trust and acceptance and transparency, when something is around for so long that you can depend on it to happen again, and it's something that's considered an issue, that probably means some shared value or principles being violated. And maybe it's on the more simpler side, like our code base is being chronically untested, and being an indicator that we're not meeting our organization's definition of production-ready code, or maybe something more severe, like that person who keeps saying things that they shouldn't, and yet no one says anything, despite the fact that we claim to care about diversity and inclusivity. These situations make people lose trust in your ability to hold truth to both your values and its ability to handle any kind of conflict. And secondly, chronic issues directly impact this team's sense of empowerment. When an issue is allowed to go on for so long, especially without action, people are left feeling unheard and like they're unable to do anything about the situation that they're in. And this kind of acquired hopelessness is never healthy. So there needs to be some source of flexibility that enables teams to prioritize issues that they deem important to improving how they work, whether that's through feedback loops that important stakeholders look and see, or making time for teams to express some sort of creative freedom. And lastly, chronic issues are also inclusion issues, because chronic issues are felt by the most vulnerable people first. And so this is a point that I think is easily lost, so I'm going to repeat it in just some different words. The flaws of an organization are always felt by the most vulnerable employees first. And so I'll elaborate on this by talking about a personal example where I felt this in the context of how teams work. So if you know me, you know that I have a seizure disorder that's sometimes pretty disruptive to my life. And prior to the pandemic, work from home wasn't nearly as common or sometimes not even allowed altogether. And even when my workplace was accommodating to my needs, it didn't save me from the feelings of exclusion that I began to feel. In an environment where I was already set apart from others because of who I am, it was just another way to make me feel like I didn't belong. And this was a pretty common experience for disabled folks. Years spent advocating for accommodating workplaces and being told it could never work, only to see the world suddenly make this shift in March 2020. So imagine reconciling the relief that we could finally be accommodated with the anger that things could have been this way all along. And the consequences of chronically ignoring the needs of disabled people was that a lot of companies and employees really struggled to transition to working remotely during a time where our literal lives were at stake. But had we listened to our disabled coworkers long ago, we all could have been reaping the benefits of remote work for much longer than the last 3 years. And instead, we not only lost the opportunity of what could have been all these years, we also lost people in the process. And so think about that consequence for a second, right? People literally lost their lives because we didn't transition to remote work quickly enough. And this is just one example of when everyone could have benefited from building our workplace with our most vulnerable employees in mind first. And there's a version of this type of issue for every vulnerable and marginalized community that exists. Furthermore, bias is a chronic issue itself. Even the healthiest cultures have bias embedded in them. So when I asked you all to think of a chronic issue earlier, if you couldn't come up with one, then bias is the first one you can start with, because I guarantee that this is a chronic issue for someone. And so how do you make sure that chronic problems don't kill your culture? What are the points of intervention? And so I defined 3 approaches to handling chronic issues. The first is preventative, the second is proactive, and the last, which is the one that we want to avoid as much as possible, is reactive. Now, the preventative approach requires you to design processes and systems that prevent these problems in the first place, and this ties it back to what I mentioned about striking the right balance of standardization and flexibility. And so by using our collective context to inform how we strike this balance, we can design systems and processes that age and scale well. And we won't be able to prevent all of our problems, of course, but it can reduce the number of problems and keep our teams focused on harder problems that will mature your team quicker. And so to do that, we have to have a way of monitoring the health of our team or organization. And so these are the feedback loops and contexts that I've mentioned, and they can take many different forms. But the point is that you should make it easy to find the patterns that serve as input for short-term and long-term improvements, again, by building these robust feedback loops. And feedback loops ultimately serve the function of communicating context and pain points through the team, which is most important for ensuring that people feel heard. And so I started off this talk by saying that understanding risk and planning for failure is a tenet of creating psychological safety, because problems will ultimately arrive. It's inevitable, but the upfront investment that you take into building robust feedback loops will drive your team towards being in a preventative or proactive stage instead of one that's reactive. So to round this an example, one robust source of feedback is on-call. So the experience of on-call is a great feedback loop for improving the way that your technology and team works, because we can learn something from every alert, every page, and every on-call task. And all of this is powerful data that we can be used to improve ourselves and the systems. Next, you should be strategic about how your team prevents chronic issues from happening in the first place. So going back to our feedback loops, we should be constantly learning from these feedback. Over time, again, building our team's collective knowledge on how to manage reliability and build excellent software. Now, this is really important for morale because people feel good when they produce excellent work, right? Now, we have to balance this time with being able to ship quickly. So when I say this, I think everyone's instinct is to kind of hold their breath because they think I don't like to run my team slowly or don't use continuous deployment. But I've always found the opposite to be true, right? When we invest early and continuously, we do this so that we're not constantly distracted by systems that are best defined by their inability to be reliable. And the most successful projects I've seen that were delivered on time were ones where a lot of thought was put into the technical design and production readiness of building software, because they ultimately made development a lot more smoother and built confidence for when we released. Now, when you're not in this mode, it's really hard to get there. It involves a degree of trust that the time you invest upfront will pay off later. So when I first introduced this way of engineering on a previous team, I heard a lot of initial pushback from my cross-functional peers who were concerned with productivity, right? So for those of us who are on teams that feel like rushing is causing a lot of your production issues, but feel stuck in that cycle, choose one project to try this out on and see how it goes. And if it goes well, use that as a model of getting buy-in and driving long-term change. Now, this long-term approach has to be complemented with a short-term approach for when our long-term approach strategy inevitably falls through from time to time. Which is why having a strategy for how you hold your team accountable to itself is important. These strategies or frameworks should be transparent and aligned with our core principles. Right? Decision-making shouldn't be happening in a silo, and our team should feel like they're part of the process. Luckily, the tech industry has come up with one solution to this need, which are service-level objectives and air budget policies. So if you're not familiar with it, service-level objectives, or SLOs, they essentially introduce transparency by defining reliability targets, right? When we hear like 99% uptime, et cetera, that's tied to SLOs. Right? It clarifies our collective expectations around what reliability experience we should be providing users. And so coupled with error budget policies, which define the measures that we actually take when we stop meeting those expectations, SLOs introduce an extra layer of accountability that makes teams resilient to failure. Now, let's talk about a very common source of pain for teams, which is on-call. Right? Most engineers I know don't look forward to on-call. I'm sure a lot of us here don't. And so this is because incident management can be stressful, right? Especially if the state of your on-call shift is best described as utter chaos. But that shouldn't be the case, right? If your engineers dread your on-call shift, then that means the state of your on-call is unhealthy, and you need to look into it further. And so incidents and on-call noise aren't the only sources of pain for on-call shifts, though. It's an unfortunately really common pattern / expectation for on-call engineers to balance the work of on-call with their long-term project work. And I totally consider this an anti-pattern, because not only is that unfair, but it also introduces instability to our roadmap if we're depending on engineers making progress in the context of a deadline. So because of this, I prefer to avoid the tension altogether by having what I refer to as dedicated on-call shifts. And so what I mean by this is that instead of forcing on-call engineers to balance both on-call and long-term project work, reinforce our empowerment principle by empowering engineers who are on call to take ownership over how they spend their on-call time outside of incidents. And so not only does this relieve the stress of needing to manage incidents and project work at the same time, but it also communicates a trust in teams to help make on-call better over time by providing a steady, continuous avenue of creative freedom for them to solve problems that bother them most. Now, the reason I don't consider this a long-term approach is because you have to be able to rely on dedicated on-call because you won't be able to only rely on dedicated on-call to navigate your issues. Not every issue or improvement can fit into like one call shift, which is usually like a week, maybe two. But it is an additional layer of reassurance, and it's a powerful way of keeping your own team accountable to itself. And lastly, it shouldn't be one leader holding the team accountable. By falling into that pattern, we're introducing a huge dependency on that leader to hold our team to its value. And much like dependencies introduce system vulnerabilities, so does the singular leader. And so even if our team or org isn't very large, we should find ways to reduce our team's dependency on leaders. Maybe that means making sure our team has strong relationships with skip levels as well, or other people in our organization. The goal here is to promote a sustainable leadership model for our team or organization, one where power is distributed so that leaders can use each other's strengths to serve the shared goal of building excellent, healthy teams. Now, let's switch to the proactive state. In the proactive state, a potentially chronic problem has emerged, but it hasn't caused significant problems yet. But we don't want them to get worse, so because we proactively monitor for early indicators, we can address issues before they have long-term impact. And so I mentioned earlier that the most vulnerable people in an organization are the first ones to feel dysfunction. And so we need to make sure that our feedback loops capture this full range of perspectives. We need to dig into the granularity of our data and our experiences because different issues will affect people differently, and different systems as well. But that doesn't mean that they aren't just as important. And so this is best served by having multiple sources of feedback loops with a stern reminder that too much process can also introduce its own set of problems. And more importantly, we should focus on making the feedback actionable. Having worked for companies with tons of bureaucracy, I've seen too many processes be a source of harm instead. And our initial solutions, right, they might not end up working. And instead of forcing our teams to accommodate the process, we can adjust the process to accommodate the needs of our teams. And so even though we should always be looking for new areas of improvement, it's okay and essential that we celebrate the progress that we do make. Showing gratitude for the ways our team step up is important. We should show up for the people who care about preventing or preserving psychological safety. Lots of us have retros, either general team ones or maybe project-specific ones, and so we should make space for explicit celebration during those rituals. And revisit your pre-mortems to see what risks you identified but ended up not happening. And make space during incident post-mortems to celebrate the things that your teams did do well during what was probably a pretty stressful time. And lastly, there's a reactive approach. At this point, the chronic issue has had a negative impact on our team already or organization, and so now we're kind of forced into addressing it. And once we've reached the state where an issue has become a chronic one, it becomes a lot harder to solve, and it becomes a lot harder to restore the trust, the team's trust of safety. Because at this point, our team has probably lost trust in its leaders, the organization in general, and worst case scenario, in each other. Now, Instead of taking this as a moment, as a signal to change, make change happen, what we often see is organizations coming to rely on acts of heroism until people reach the point of burnout. And when I say heroism and burnout here, I'm not just referring to the type of burnout that we tend to think of, which is overworking. I'm also referring to the type of emotional burnout when something happens in an environment that's unhealthy, whether that's something like constant underappreciation or something more severe like dealing with bias or harassment. So it goes without saying that heroism and burnout are not effective strategies for organizational failures, because that's ultimately what we're asking people to do when they're put in that situation, to make up for organizational failures by sacrificing their well-being. Now, let's expand on the cultural and organizational consequences of heroism some more. So heroes prevent true progress because they're ultimately band-aids to systemic issues. They prevent progress by enabling us to put off the hard work of actually addressing the deeper organizational flaws. And so kind of like tech debt, right, it might be effective in the short term, but it's not an effective long-term strategy for building sustainable organizations. Eventually, we have to pay that tech debt back, or that organizational debt back. And the way we pay that back tends to be in the form of burnout. And not only is it awful for the people who have to experience that, but it's also awful for our organizations, right? We know how awful it is when an engineer leaves, and we shouldn't be giving them additional reasons to. And if we're not in the position where, or if we're in the position where we're still forced to be engaging in heroics, take that as information for whether this is the type of environment you even want to be a part of. And lastly, the impact of heroism isn't distributed equally. It looks different depending on your personhood. For some, it's a point of celebration. For others, it's merely an extension of what might already be a psychologically unsafe environment. For example, right, when people with more power present themselves as heroes in the workplace, they're usually celebrated for it. But for others, it can feel like an expansion of what might already be unfair expectations. And so setting this precedent only means furthering the unfair expectations that get placed on marginalized people. And so if you've ever heard the phrase that we have to work like twice as hard to get half the recognition, and this is because who we choose to celebrate is a reflection of our values and is coded in our biases. And the privilege of choosing to participate in heroics isn't afforded to everyone. The second part of this third consequence here is that heroism often leads to disproportionate power between teammates. And so earlier I said how leaders should reduce the team's dependency on leaders. And so this applies to everyone on a team or organization, right? Heroism is dangerous because it redistributes power by putting people in a position where they have to depend on heroes. And this is why it's so important about having a leadership core. When a team or organization becomes so dependent on one person, especially when that person is leader, it can start to feel like they're untouchable, like they're incapable of doing anything wrong, and therefore of being held accountable. So what do we do when we get here? Fortunately, I'm here to deliver some perhaps obvious but hard truths, right? When a team reaches this state, leaders are the ones responsible for the organizational failures that got them there. Blameless post-mortem culture is a wonderful tool, right? But it doesn't apply to leadership. In fact, a crucial part of blameless post-mortem culture is that you shift towards identifying the systemic reasons that cause the problem. And so while blameless post-mortem culture might not agree that leaders are at fault for these issues, blameless post-mortem culture definitely agrees that leadership is responsible for them. And this is the thing that we see leaders struggle with a lot, right? I know that I personally struggle with this. It can be really hard to reconcile the fact that most of the problems that we have to solve or work on aren't directly our fault, but that they are our responsibility. And that, ironically, as much as we don't want to cast blame and whatnot, it's when we ignore our responsibilities as leaders that issues actually start to become our fault. And so here's another hard truth, right? Sometimes you or your leadership core are those leaders, and the onus is on us to take responsibility. And sometimes what that looks like is holding whoever's leadership to us accountable in the ways we have access to, but it's also just as important that we recognize the role that we play in organizational failures. Because the higher up in leadership you are, the more our flaws have the potential to scale across our entire organization. And so use whatever access you have to action on that responsibility. Sometimes we have to be strategic about it, about when to use that privilege that comes with leadership, especially for those of us who are underrepresented. But most people tend to generally underestimate and underutilize that privilege in the context of leadership, but I think in the world in general. Now, I've thrown around the word responsibility a lot, but given no direction to what that looks like. So taking responsibility as a leader is wildly complex and contextual. But I think the approach can generally be narrowed down to three steps. The first, and I know I'm running out of time, is to admit where we went wrong, admit that we played a role in letting it get this way, whether our role was direct or one of enablement. People usually actually appreciate a lot more when we're able to be vulnerable about where we went wrong, especially if we follow up with action. Because psychological safety is about being vulnerable, is about feeling safe to make mistakes, but also while trusting that you're in an environment that seeks to minimize psychological harm through accountability. And this is really what it means to be trauma-informed. It's not just about feeling safe that we as individuals can make mistakes. It's also about preserving safety in spite of the mistakes that inevitably end up happening. Which is why the second step of taking responsibility is centering the folks impacted. And this is where we really need to practice empathy, right? Who was harmed in the process? Who had to step up as a hero or leader because we didn't? And we should thank them, reward them, and ask them what they need to rebuild trust. We might not always be able to provide what they need, and oftentimes it honestly might even be too late to rebuild that trust anyway. But at least they deserve to have their experience honored through change and actions. And selfishly, their thoughts and words can serve as a reminder that the work of leadership isn't about us, it's about the teams we want to be mutually successful with. And lastly, the actual changes you follow up with. That means revisiting the preventative and proactive measures that you have in place, right? We should ask ourselves, where did our processes fail to get us there? What cultural or organizational flaws contributed to it? And tying back to what we just talked through in the last slide, when centering those who were impacted, ask for their thoughts on these questions without placing the burden on them. And we can do this by putting our own thought into what changes would be impactful and asking, like, what did we miss? What's not obvious to us might be obvious to them. So we should ask them because experiences and feedback they provide is powerful data that we can use to improve our organization. And we should always consider the vulnerability that comes with sharing these experiences and thoughts a gift, and honor that gift by following up with action. Depending on the situation, what these actions look like can vary, but approach it from like a systems thinking angle, right? What organizational change can we drive to remedy the situation and make sure it doesn't happen again? And depending on the situation, we might have to make some tough decisions. And this is really hard, right? But it's also it's really crucial because threats to psychological safety aren't a trade-off that we should make lightly. And leadership is earned and not owed continuously because just like the flaws of our organization are felt by our most vulnerable coworkers, so are the flaws of our leaders. Now, one final note. I know none of what I said is easy, right? All of this is easier said than done. In the talk with speakers afterwards, a lot of this was, my decision to go on leave was influenced by a lot of this. So if you want to go more deep into that, I'm willing to share more personal details. Now, my hardest moments as a team or tech lead were ones I had to deal with these types of complex issues, right? Whether that was stepping up in light of difficult situations like harassment or bias, or driving serious change to a culture that requires or that enables burnout. And every single one does take a little bit out of us, but that's the price we pay for the privilege of leadership. And as leaders, we should never lose sight of that privilege, the privilege to cultivate culture, to cultivate community, in a way that achieves excellence without sacrificing people along the way. And in a world where sacrificing people in the name of business needs is unfortunately common, choose to bring this energy, this way of thinking, all the ways that you have access to. Trust me, that as hard or as frankly scary as it might be, having been on the side where my access to that was very minimal, the heartache that often comes with leadership is still one of the best privileges I've ever had. And so honor that privilege by being honest with yourself and others about where your organization isn't doing right by people, where you might not even be doing right by people. And so this is why we attend conferences like this, right? To refine our craft and by being exposed to other people with experiences that we can learn from. And so honor your craft as a leader by surrounding yourself around people who can hold you accountable and whom you can do the same for. Leadership can be really lonely, but it doesn't have to be for our sake, and especially for the sake of the people who have the privilege of leading. Thank you.